I am not a photojournalist. If you've been here before, you know that. I like to take creative license in editing my photos because I want to edit and make the photo look the way I want to make the photo look. That, for me, is one of the joys of editing and, frankly, just one of the cool things that you can do because of all the powerful tools that we have. So in other words, I like to transform photos from maybe a snapshot to a great shot. And I've got a perfect example of that today where I'm going to be in Luminar Neo walking through how I took something. In fact, this is the photo, and this was shot in London in about 2011. I literally just started taking photos probably a year or so before. Didn't really know a whole lot about what I was doing. You can see this is essentially a snapshot. And I don't mean that as an insult, but I stood there, handheld, took a photo, and said, okay, well, I got a photo of Big Ben. It wasn't an amazing sunset. It wasn't bad. It was decent light. It's a cool view because I just like the view and I like London a lot, but it's nothing really interesting or magical or whatever. And what I want to do is essentially transform the photo. But what I found is that when people try to transform a photo, and by the way, I'm pointing my finger at myself in this case because I'm super guilty of this, and that is they'll just amp up everything, detail, color, change the light around, maybe replace the sky, do lots of different things. Totally cool. If that's what you want to do, have at it. But I prefer, when I'm doing, most of the time, I should say, just to clarify, most of the time I prefer to do my transformation kind of subtly because what I find is that small steps really add up into a big overall change. That's what we're doing today. So I'm going to get this photo. It's a raw file. I'm going to go ahead and start here and develop raw. And basically what I like to do is start out with a little bit of adjustment to the light, right, of course, because I'm trying to get that in order, if you will. And that's going to involve a little bit of highlights, a little bit of shadows, a little bit of contrast. It's not really anything big or massive or anything like that. I am going to adjust the white balance. I think the tint is fine. A little bit of vibrance here, maybe a 5. A little bit of sharpening, maybe a 15 or 20. And I like to go into transform in photos like this. And in this case, with the vertical and transform, I'm going to go -1. And all that really does is kind of slightly tilt the photo a little bit better. So if you look at the before and the after, you can see now that it's tilted a little bit more forward. And that often happens when you're shooting architectures that, depending on how close you are and if you have a wide angle lens, the verticals may not be great, and transform is super helpful for that. So I feel like already I've done, a decent start. I'm a long way from getting this transformation done, but if you have the before and the after, I think I'm off to a good start. And what I'm going to do now is go into super contrast, one of my favorite tools, and make some basic adjustments here. I'm still playing with the light, and if you hit the J key anytime you're using or editing a photo, that'll basically show you areas that are blown out and areas that are basically in completely dark shadows. So I'm going to do that here in just a second and show you that I basically still have blown out highlights. Let me hit the J key, and that's everything in red is completely blown out. But that's okay. We're still going to play with that and kind of fix it and kind of lean into it. So there it is. Let me tell you what. Let me hit the J key and turn that off. But there it is before super contrast, and there it is after. Pretty minor. But if I hit the J key again, you can see I got a lot of things that need work. Now, Accent AI is a tool that actually helps with that. I don't really talk about this a lot, but it can help you with that because it does really an amazing job of essentially balancing out the light. The thing I always say is with Accent AI, you have to be careful not to go too high, and generally speaking, I'm not going to do it in this photo, but generally speaking, I prefer to use Accent AI with a mask. In this photo, I'm applying it across the entire image because it needs some work, it needs a little oomph, and I'm not afraid or opposed to giving the photo a little kick early in the editing process to kind of help me get along on my way to a finished photo. So there it is before, and there it is after. And again, one more time, J key, still got a few blown out spots. We're going to fix some of that as we continue to go along. Now, I've done a little bit with the light, and one of the other things I like to do is play with structure or the appearance of detail. And what I like to do is I like to smooth out skies and water, and I like to add structure to things like buildings. I'm going to do all of that here right now. The first one is sky. I'm going to do like a -32 or something. I'm going to use Mask AI because it does do a pretty good job of finding the stuff that I need in this photo, but it's not perfect, and I'm going to show you a little trick to make it a little bit more perfect. So if I click on sky, it does a really good job of finding the sky. I mean, it isolates the sky nearly perfectly, and I'm sure a lot of that is because their sky replacement capability in Luminar is just so good. So if you look at that mask, I mean, it's essentially perfect. So now I've got that smoothing across the sky, which I'm quite happy with. So I'm going to close Structure AI, but I want to open it again. And I said skies and water. I'm not using this tool for water. I'm going to show you another trick that I love to do on what love to do. And it's a great tool for transformation, which is what we're talking about in this photo. Now, what I want to do here is, of course, add some structure to these buildings. Here's the thing. If I go in and create a mask with Mask AI, and if I click on architecture, which it identifies, you're going to find, look how much overlap there is in these areas around the edges. And sometimes that's a big deal, sometimes it's not. The truth is, I don't use Mask AI a ton because of things like this, where I end up having to come in and erase, and I figure, you know what I can do? I can just come in and mask it with the brush, cover the majority of the area pretty quickly, and not have to worry about the edges, because if you add a lot of structure or light adjustments or color adjustments, but you don't fix those edges, you end up with a halo around that whole skyline. Effectively would have a bit of a halo later in the edit. It'll become obvious. Well, I don't want that. You probably don't want that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm not going to use architecture. In fact, I'm just going to reset this whole tool just so that nothing is shown. You can see that I haven't done anything with it. I'm going to open it again. I'm going to go back into Mask. I'm going to go back into Mask AI. But remember how good this sky mask was when I went negative structure? Here's what I like to do. I'm going to actually choose sky, I'm going to choose architecture, and I'm going to choose water. I'm going to choose all three of them. So I'm effectively grabbing the entire photo with the mask. But what I want to do is I'm going to now come in, I'm going to remove water. So it's going to take the water away, and I'm going to remove sky. And it's going to take the sky away. And you can tell now these edges, they're not perfect, but they're 50 to 75% better than they were when I just selected architecture. So when you have that kind of problem where that, in this case, the architecture Mask AI is kind of overlapping into sky, consider taking the sky and the architecture, adding both masks, and then removing the sky. It's what I call stack and subtract. It's a great little masking method, a little trick that'll clean that up. And now, if I was to go in and clean up these masks, I would have less to do around these edges. In fairness, I'm not going to do it in this video, but I do recommend doing it. In the interest of time, I'm not going to do that. But you can see I've got a much cleaner mask, and now I can come in and just add my positive structure where I want it to go, and I'm going to do like 48 or 50, something like that. And I've effectively just isolated that architecture better using stack and subtract in Mask AI than just using the architecture setting in Mask AI. So before and after. Okay, so we're moving right along. I said I like to remove detail from skies and water. I like to add detail to things like man-made structures, but I didn't do anything in the water. You recall that I removed that or didn't use it with the negative structure, which is something I really do. And the reason I like to do that is because I just like smooth water. Now, when you're shooting handheld, there's no way you're going to get smooth water. You have to have like a multi-second kind of exposure to get that flow, to get that nice blur in the water that makes it look like a long exposure, because that is a long exposure. You're not going to get that handheld, and I definitely wasn't able to get that 13 years ago, whatever it was, with a quick handheld snap in low light. But there is a little trick for doing that, and that is to use the blur tool. So I'm going to go into blur, and what I'm going to do is go into masking. Now, you can use Mask AI. It identifies the water quite well, but if you recall, it's a little bit sketchy along the edges. So in situations like this, for me, it's much easier just to use a linear gradient. So I'm going to come in with the linear gradient, and I'm going to click and drag up, and I'm going to go something about like this. I need to get this situated. So I think I'm going to do about like that. I've essentially covered all the water, and I'm trying to fade it into the embankment on the other side. And then in adjustments, you just go to motion blur. That motion blur is only going to apply to the mask, which is just the water. And then you come up over here and you drag it to the number that you like the most, which for me was like a 70, 71. And now I've got a beautiful long exposure that isn't actually a long exposure. Now, there is something to think about here when you're editing, and that is the long exposure looks really good in the water. It's not the same amount of long exposure in the sky. So you could come in and also add that kind of motion blur to the sky. I'm not going to do that in this video, but depending on how many clouds you have and how fast moving they are or what kind of look you want to achieve, it may make more sense to go ahead and apply that to the sky as well. I think it's fine here to, I could do something less here, but I really like the number like around 60, 65, 70. I'm at 64. I'll just leave that. Got a nice sense of blur, motion, whatever you want to call it, flowing water. I've got soft skies, which I think kind of go together. But again, if you wanted to blur the clouds and make it look like they were streaming across the sky rapidly, you could apply that in the sky as well. But bottom line is, I wanted to use blur here to accentuate and create the look of that long exposure because I'm doing a transformation. I'm not just doing a regular edit. So if you look at the water before, choppy, quick, quarter second, I don't know what it was. It probably less than that actually because it was handheld. But quick snap, ugly water. Now I've got nice, beautiful flowing water. I've got a long exposure and I'm liking where I am. So having done all that, I am now going to jump into some color work. And this is where some of the fun begins. Although I've already had fun. All of it's fun for me, but I do like my colors. Brilliance and warmth, I'm going to do about a 10 on both. And you'll notice, except for the high number on the blur in the water, I'm not making huge moves. I'm not doing 70 like I did on the blur in all these. Some of them are kind of in the medium, but I'm being specific and targeted. I kind of have a plan. And I'm trying to do subtle stacking of edits so that I don't overdo any particular thing like color, which I'm about to use a few color tools, which is a little bit of a breaking of the, I'm going to say rule that I often talk about, which is don't use too many color tools on any particular image. I'm going to use a few here, but I'm going to do that with split color warmth, and then I'm going to get into color balance. I'm going to start with the shadows, and I'm going to do about a 4 on the blue just in the shadows. This is why I like color balance so much, because you're isolating those color moves just to the different tonal areas. It's a little bit like having a luminosity mask for color, which I love. So I'm going to do about a 5 in the midtones on the red. So in other words, I'm warming up the midtones, which is going to be a fair amount of the photo. And in the highlights, I'm going to do something similar. I'm going to do about a 6 here. So 6, but a -5 on magenta. And that's just personal preference. That's because I like magenta in my sunsets. It's just a thing. But the red and the magenta, I think, go together. And I'm starting to get a nice color look overall to the photo. If you look at the before and the after, I like the colors in the sky. They're kind of soft, they're warm, they're kind of yummy, that sort of thing. So I think that's looking pretty good. I'm going to grab landscape and golden hour and do like a 15 or 16 across the entire photo. I think that looks fine. But one thing I don't like is it's a little too saturated on the buildings. I didn't copy that mask earlier, and I need to use it again, but I can recreate it quickly by going into Mask AI, because once you've used it, remember, it basically identifies those elements again really quickly. I'm going to grab all 3. I'm going to subtract water, and I'm going to subtract sky. So once again, I'm left with a pretty clean mask just around the architecture, and I'm just going to go into the saturation of the orange. And I'm going to bring that down a bit. It's just a little too orange and colorful and saturated, even for me. But, I think it looks a little bit better like that, where I'm toning that down a little bit. There it is before, and there it is after. Now, I do notice that there are splotches of light that are hitting the building. And you could, if you really wanted to take the time, go in and with a lower strength brush, kind of dodge and burn to kind of balance that out. I recognize it in the photo. I am not going to do that in this video, but it's something to think about, which is always pay attention to how the light is lying across your photo and across any subject that may be in your photo or prominent object or whatever it may be. But regardless, all of it was a little too orange along the buildings. I've taken it from that to that with a quick stack and subtract Mask AI usage. And now that I've done that, I've got a couple of moves left. I'm going to come in and go back to develop. I never fix the highlights all the way. And I generally do that up front, but sometimes what you'll find is as you're moving light and color around, it's going to impact the look of the highlights and that sort of thing. So it's still kind of blowing off the top there. And if I hit the J key, still a fair amount of highlights. This is where I kind of come back after I do global edits at the beginning, and then I do some local edits, which is like the detail and the color kind of targeted. And then I come back and generally do global edits. And that's what I'm doing here. This is kind of in the wrap-up phase of an edit. and I'm going to bring these highlights way down, like a -50 or something, and you will see now that they're starting to look a lot better. If you look at my histogram, and if I hit my J key, no more highlight problem. So you can fix those later in the edit, even if you don't fix them perfectly at the beginning. You can still come back and fix them later and have a nice result. I'm going to lift the shadows a little bit. I'm actually going to change the temperature. It's a little bit warm for me, and I did a little bit of amplification of some of the warmer colors in color balance a couple of minutes ago. So what I'm going to do is come in and cool it off a little bit and add a little bit more of that magenta that I like. I just like that. It doesn't have to be what you want to do, but I think, my personal opinion is, I like the warm stuff, but I also like the interplay of the overall cooler temperature with the magenta. So I pretty much, not every photo, but a lot of photos, I'll take my temperature left and my tint to the right. And again, it's just personal preference. It's just kind of a color look that I like. Slight bit of vibrance. We've already got a lot of color. I don't want to overdo it. So I'm going to stop with develop there. And I actually came in and gave a tiny bit of bump in the highlights, something like that, to give it a little bit more warmth, just an overall global touch of that. And 15 might be a little much. Maybe I'll make that a 10. It's just a tiny little touch in the highlights only of warmth. So before and after, it's pretty minor. I'm not sure how well you can see it. And there's two things I want to do left. Two things left that I want to do. The first one is, if you look at the clock, you can't really see the face of the clock. Well, there's an easy way to fix that. Go into develop, get a mask, get a radial gradient, and just draw that circle right here in the middle of the face of the clock. Make it cover that clock as best as you can. So I'm going to do something like that, and then I'm going to pull the gradient zone in because I don't really need, most of the time, I highly recommend a large gradient zone when you're doing masks because you want it to fade. Here, you don't really need it because I don't want it to fade. I just want the circle to kind of be there on the face of the clock. Zoom in, take your time, make sure you get it right. Again, not really what I'm doing here, but I'm just going to lift that exposure, and I'm brightening the face of that clock. I'm going to lift the whites, so I'm making it a little bit wider, which makes it a little bit brighter. And I'm going to give it a slight bump in temperature just to give it a tiny bit of warmth because I don't want it to just be bright and white. I want it to look nice and kind of fit with the sunset look overall. So maybe something about like that. If you look at the before and the after, it's much more visible, and everybody likes the clock face there, what we Americans call Big Ben. I love it. It's part of the beauty of that scene, I think. Of course, it's an iconic symbol of London, and I wanted to brighten that up and bring it to life. So before and after, quick little hit with the radio mask does that, and then a vignette is really all I'm going to do. And I'm just going to kind of slap this on. Roughly speaking, I think that'll cover me. And, I'm pretty set. I did not use inner light here. I think there's enough brightness on the building, and inner light is going to really, by default, sit in the center of the photo, which is right here. By the way, the inner light that I'm talking about is in the vignette tool. I usually do that, but I'm pointing out why I didn't do it here. I feel like I'm bright enough there, and I don't really want to center the vignette over here to the right. Even though Big Ben is kind of the subject, I'm not really... the whole scene is kind of the subject. So that's why I didn't use inner light, because I normally do. Wanted to explain that. Anyway, there's my photo. If you look at the before, snapshot. I mean, really, stood there. I was like, this is cool. I'm in London. I love it. I've got a cheap camera that I don't know how to use, and I'm taking a picture of an iconic thing. It's a terrible photo. I took it anyway. I'm happy. That's kind of my thinking in 2011. I didn't know a lot about what I was doing, but there's my snap, and now I've turned it into something that's, it's not exactly what I saw, and that's okay. We're talking about transformation. I'm not a photojournalist, but I like the result. I mean, I feel like I took a photo that's 12, 13, 14 years old, wasn't particularly good, and I turned it into something that I really, really like. Before, after. Transformation is easy. There's a lot of tools that can help you along your way. Think about light, think about detail, think about color, and think about global edits first. Think about local edits with masks second. And then consider finishing up with more global edits if you need to. Make a plan, be targeted, don't overdo it. You don't have to hit everything with a big slider move to have a huge impact. These were lots of little moves, lots and lots of moves, but none of them were significant, and yet the end result is a massive, massive transformation. That's how I think about it, my friends. That's how I go about it. Hope it gives you some ideas. Thanks for watching. I'll be back really soon. You guys take care, and until next time, adios.